In today's episode of HR Visionaries, I talk to Theresa from 3Pillar Global. We talk about the importance of AI in communicating to people spread around the world, which is, of course, in particular important when you work in a remote first environment. Stay tuned. Welcome to HR Visionaries, where we unlock the secrets of modern HR. I'm Benjamin, your host. Join us as we shed light on today's HR universe with HR leaders and innovators from across the globe. Whether you're an HR pro, a business leader, or just curious about the future of work, this is your shortcut to the forefront of HR innovation. Brought to you by Hire, the AI talent attraction platform. Welcome to our latest episode of HR Visionaries. I'm looking forward to my guest today, Theresa. Thanks a lot for taking the time.
Yes, I'm very excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Theresa, can you tell us in 5 or 6 sentences, who are you?
Oh man, I am a mom and a wife. I am a coach, executive coach. I am a HR leader, and I am a city dweller. I love living in a city.
Great. Theresa, can you tell us a bit more about your role as HR leader?
Yes. So I work for 3Pillar Global, which is a global professional services firm specializing in digital product development for clients. So we build tools that are then sold on the market. Things like if you think about like the New York Times app or NPR app or PBS app, all of those sort of applications that you pay for are what our teams specialize in developing for different companies. And as a HR leader, I work with our global teams. We have about 22 to 2,400 team members around the world, 90 in the US, and then the rest situated across Latin America, Europe, and Canada and India. And I work on HR management. So looking at the systems, the compensation, the compliance, as well as our HR partnership with the business. So that's my primary role. I've led facilities in the past. I've led total rewards. And just recently, which I may not have told you, I've stepped into our product development organization, really helping to fine tune the way that we build out our employee journey within the product development team, which is about 2,000 of the consultants, professional services that we provide.
It's super exciting, and I have so many follow-up questions given, well, being so global presents probably its own challenges. However, let me ask, so why did you choose a career in HR, not in a different field?
Yeah, I always think that HR kind of chose me, to be honest. When I was growing up, my dad.
It's like the ring. The
It
ring,
is,
Lord of the
yes.
Rings, right?
Yeah,
So to
yeah,
choose you.
exactly. It chose me. When I was growing up, my dad he owned a company, and he would always tell me, as I hope most good dads do, like, you could be anything you want when you grow up. One day you could be the CEO of your own company. And I would say, Dad, I don't want to be the CEO. I just want to help people. And so I can see kind of these nuggets throughout I was what's called like a peer counselor in high school. In college, I led change management for a large scale change that happened on my campus. And then I went into just a generic business role and ended up in HR because I just kept wanting to work on problems related to how we make the workforce a great place for people to be.
Working with people is a kind of a common theme for many HR professionals, right? So, hey,
Yeah.
my passion is to help support people advancing their careers. How did you find out that is the right course for you?
Oh, such a good question. I actually am very passionate about helping people figure out like what their path is, because I was one of those like perpetual, I have no idea what I want to be when I grow up people. But it all started with a leader. I was a executive assistant / project manager. and realized like my soul was dying in this role. It was like a horrible experience. I went into my boss, who I loved, and I quit on the spot. I said, I don't know what I want to be doing, but it's not this. Like, I have to find something else. And he very graciously said, you're doing a really good job at this. Why don't you take time to figure out what it is you want to be doing before you quit? And so I chose three different fields. One was organizational development. The second was urban planning. And the third was international higher education. And I went down this path where every month I would read an article on a topic related to those fields. And I would try and meet with somebody in that field. And very quickly, I was realizing I was so drawn to the work in organizational development. So I was meeting with HR leaders and consultants, and they were giving me book recommendations, and I was voraciously reading those book recommendations. And so that led me down some internal projects at the company I was at that were very HR related. It still took me a few years. I was in global learning and organizational development for a little while, and they asked me to step into strategy and planning. And so I did that, which was moving back out of HR. And then as I was ending kind of a project within that role, I said, you know what, I'm just going to make a run for it. And so I moved into human capital consulting. And then from there, kind of it's been on that path ever since.
For being an HR professional, well, your role probably is a lot about helping other peoples to find, well, what they really want to do in life and
Yeah.
to figure that out. So, how do you think should people approach this ideally? Well, not from the me perspective, but more from the, let's say, from the coaching perspective, from the perspective as a, well, as an advisor to guide people towards, like, what are they really good at, what do they really like doing?
Yeah, it's such a great question. What I have found to be most helpful, and when I worked at Deloitte in consulting for a while, and I had a mentor, David Miskanyar, who was just an incredible resource for me at the time. He recommended, rather than looking at what job do you want, like what title, what position do you want, because I could never figure it out. Um,
There's
he
so many.
encouraged me. Yeah, it's a hard thing to do. Like I've always envied the people that knew from like age 3 they wanted to be a doctor. Not me. And most of us, it turns out, like most of the population don't really know what they want to be, or they think they do and they get into it and find it's not really what they love. But what he encouraged me to do is to think about in 10 years, what are the activities, the things, even the values that are most important to me that I want to be doing more of more frequently.
Mhm.
And so I tweaked that to say, what do I want to be the best in the world at 10 years from now? And that's how I ask people the question. So like I could ask you, 10 years from now, Benjamin, what would you want to be the best in the world at? And it doesn't have
Wow.
to be a job. It would be like things that you love about your work or things that you love doing.
Wow, that's such a remarkable question. But it's well, for me, it actually would be the very similar thing, actually. So, well, working with people, well, advancing them in their career, being like the go-to person in how can I develop as an organization, as a person. But it's an amazing question given like the time horizon of 10 years. Is so incredibly unpredictable, right? And it's so far down the road. It's a question I probably need some more minutes to think about, to be
Yes,
honest.
absolutely. So typically what I do is I ask people like write down just throughout your day, what are the things that you're loving that you're doing? And people typically come up with a list of like 30, 40 things. And then I say like group them because you'll find common themes. Like for me, what I found is I enjoy tasks where I'm either helping somebody define what their career path is, I love tasks where I'm helping them define a learning plan. I love tasks where a leader asks me for feedback on a team member and I have to give it. Or I love performance review conversations with my team. And so I just wrote all of those things down, and then you can group them and say, there's something here. I don't know what bucket you would put it in, but there's something about developing people. And for me, that was recognizing like talent development is a priority. And then defining further, once you come up with those kind of categories, just sitting with it for a little while and saying, like you said, working with people, advancing people, being the go-to in the organization, refining down to the, like, what does that actually look like?
Mm-hmm.
And then what I did is just met with people who I think are the best in the world at those things. So for me, it was executive leadership is one of those buckets, human capital strategy, talent development or management, and HR capabilities. And so from there, I just met with people that I think are the best in the world at that. And I asked them, like, what are the capabilities that you think you need to be best in the world at being an executive leader? And then that brought me to an exercise where I'm writing down hard and soft skills that I would need or that I possess. And then I ask people for targeted feedback that have worked with me. So in executive leadership, I might go to a past boss or somebody who's reported into me and say, you know, I think these are the most critical skills for being a strong executive leader, you know, demonstrating influence, providing clear direction, being able to craft a roadmap that others can follow. How well do you think I do at those? And is there one area that you would say I should focus on? And from there, to be honest with you, that's how I make career decisions. Like I look at those lists of 4 things. I look at roles and I say, am I going to be doing more of these things? And am I going to be closing gaps in the skills that I want to have to be the best in the world? And am I going to be leveraging new skills that I want to grow in? And then from there, I've had kind of a kind of meandering path, but it sure has been fun. So
It sounds
that's
like
my recommendation for people.
it sounds like an incredibly structured and very analytical way to approach the entire topic of, hey, where should I go? Where am I going? Is it something you developed yourself, or was it something that was brought to you by a coach or by a mentor?
Yeah, so I mentioned that my mentor at Deloitte was the primary, like
Mhm.
he encouraged me to think in these buckets rather
Mhm.
than in terms of um, like what job you want.
Mhm.
I just took it from there. Like one of my pet peeves is when people define, so if I define that I want to be an executive leader and I declare that I'm going to be the best in the world at executive leadership, but then I go out and I talk to 5 people who work closely with me
Mhm.
and they say you have absolutely none of the skills related to that. Like that's where I wanted to make sure that I developed some self-awareness in the process. Recognizing, and I think I hold this view that if you are truly passionate about something and you can develop self-awareness in what you are good at and what you are not, then you absolutely, if I want to be an executive leader and I'm horrible at it today, but I have the motivation and I'm going to develop the capabilities, then absolutely I should have that in my top 4. Whether or not I become the best in the world or I become an adequate executive leader, at least I will be doing the things that I love. Um, but that piece of asking for feedback was really important to me.
Mhm.
And then the element of deciding on jobs based on the skills and capabilities that I would be learning and growing in, maybe specific to me in that my primary driver is learning. Like I love to learn. And so that in and of itself is enough for me to be engaged and excited. For somebody else, like my husband did the same exercise. And for him, the skills piece wasn't as helpful
Mhm.
um, because he's also not as analytical as I am. So he found it fine to do the high level exercise, a good exercise to kind of ground him. But he doesn't find the learning piece as exciting as I do.
I must say, I find in particular the feedback sessions incredibly interesting. Given, I think it helps to well, helps a lot in your perspective on yourself. So I recognize that, well, many people in particular people in leadership positions, they well, some of them do know very well what they're good at and what they are bad at, and some are just like have a very strange self conscience, so to say. So in terms of like, hey, well, talking about X, Y, Z, and being, to be honest, horrible at it. However, they truly believe they're quite good at this, and therefore, well, this external feedback, I guess, helps a lot to think about, okay, what am I good at, and where do I need some coaching? And if I'm not that great at something, it's actually not, well, it doesn't say, well, I'm a terrible leader or anything. It just needs, well, it requires a bit of exercise in this area. Then,
Absolutely. And I do think one on the self-awareness piece, there was an HBR article that me and a couple of friends were talking about the other day that talks about how many of us think we are self-aware and how many of us actually are self-aware. And you can imagine that the gap between those two numbers is quite large. So I'm a big advocate of asking for feedback to close those gaps that exist in all of us. On the point of feedback, the piece that I have found helpful, we are naturally resistant to providing critical feedback to others. And what I've found helpful about asking, I want to be the best in the world as an executive leader, what would be the thing that you would focus on if you were me? Gives you that feedback without having somebody tell you you're a horrible leader. And so I've found that to be incredibly useful. Another way is to ask for advice. So like right now I'm in the middle of this refreshing of what are the skills? Like a lot of them I've now exercised. What is the next thing for me, for example, to be a strong executive leader? And a new skill that I've recognized is engaging with board leaders and engaging with the needs of the talent within your organization and the gap between what your board or executive leadership are looking for or expecting and what your team members would like or expect. And yesterday alone, I was on a call with a chief people officer of a much larger company. And I just asked, like, how do you navigate this delta between the two things? And that alone gave me some good ideas for what skills I want to focus on, both in terms of, she was talking about really listening and understanding and repeating back and acknowledging what the board members are looking for, and also developing a data-driven approach for influencing that agenda. And so it was helpful for me to revamp my own skill set and say, okay, what are the skills I need to start practicing in order to develop that capability?
well, you mentioned before that you guys have a presence in the US where you are based, but also you have many people, more than 2,000 people based in several different locations around the world. I imagine this being quite a challenge to manage, and you then definitely need some kind of a very analytical approach to things, because you, well, can't build a relationship to 2,000 people.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. You know, when I think about our workforce, we have 90 employees in the US, so the rest are in other places around the world.
That's like 5%, right?
It is, yeah. And all of our clients, because we're a professional services firm, nearly all of our clients are in the US or in Canada. And so it is an interesting kind of dynamic that I'm really sensitive to, which is you have a very US-centric leadership focus, while a majority of your team is sitting around the world in different cultures, different places. And so my job is largely to help kind of bridge that gap and understand our team member perspective, and also serve as that bridge to our largely US leadership. But I get to spend, you didn't ask this, but I get to wake up in the morning. I talk to India first, have all my calls with India. Then I get on with Romania and Czechia, which very different from India in terms of culture and population and needs. And then I get on with Mexico, Guatemala, Costa Rica, and then end my day in the US and Canada. And for me personally, I found that is endlessly engaging and entertaining to me. Like my brain just like loves having to context switch, having to understand different priorities and ways that people are thinking about things. But also, it makes me really grateful to be in the world today and have such wonderful people all around the world that I get to work with. So you didn't ask that, but I felt like I needed to say it because I just love it so much.
And well, you can definitely feel that you love it. I was wondering, how do you actually approach this? So how do you approach, well, dealing with very different cultures? Well, on a daily basis, you basically jet around the world from India to Eastern Europe to Latin America and then to the US. So it's always a kind of a travel or a journey around the world for you every day.
It is.
How do you approach this?
Yeah.
All the different cultures you're dealing with, and something that might be very much appropriate in one country may cause some offense in another country. So therefore, you need to be always like very much on the spot, working permanently with different countries.
Yeah, it's such a great question. I would say I've worked with a number, I'll use the example of working with Eastern Europe because it was a part of the world that in my previous roles I had not worked with.
Mhm.
Whereas I've worked with India and Latin America, Canada, and the US for quite some time. So it's most fresh on my mind. But the first thing that I think is really critical is to read. Like
Mhm.
there's so much research right now. There's no reason why we should be going into these situations blind. And so whether it's reading novels that are from authors in the region or it's reading business books about the culture, it does give you a good sense of like how things operate in the culture. So that's the first thing I do is make sure that I'm well read. Even for Latin America that I've worked with for a number of years, I recently picked up a book. It's like I don't have it at my desk right now, but and the title is like embarrassing. It's like doing business in Latin America, economics and leadership, or something really boring. Admittedly, I did not read it end to end. I picked out chapters to read. But I find it really helpful to just keep apprised of what matters, both from a culture and motivation perspective, as well as a history
Mhm.
perspective. So in Eastern Europe, the first thing that I spend a lot of time doing is asking questions, like asking about families, asking about your life outside of work, asking about how you progressed in your career, observing things. So I find it really useful to go into the culture. So, for example, this last summer, me and my family spent 6 weeks in Romania and Czechia. And there are things that you can pick up that do not make sense until you are in the culture. For example, my colleagues were telling me like in Romania, like we are very innovative, but we are also inflexible.
Mhm.
And I did not understand that until I was standing in line at a salad bar and it's all the salad ingredients in the salad bar. And then they had like pre-made items that you could select. And I said, well, I want this one, but can I get these three different ingredients in it? And they were like, no. And I was like, but they're right there. And they were like, absolutely not. And so I didn't end up getting the salad I wanted, but it gave me a good perspective of like when they say like it fell outside of the realm of
Mhm.
possible
Mhm.
in that cultural context. And so it was a helpful insight that then I could take with me and say, oh, like I don't fully understand this. Like I come from a very US American culture where anything is possible and we're going to just shake things up for the sake of shaking them up. And so it was helpful to be in that context and see the way that people interact and understand like, oh, when you say inflexible, this is what you mean. That looks like. So that's the observation. And then I also ask for advice. So when I'm rolling things out, I always try and find a few advocates or individuals in region who become kind of my cultural mentors. And I try and find the people that are maybe a little bit more blunt and are just going to tell it like it is. They might not be the people that you would necessarily put in the senior leadership role of the region, They might be somebody who's entry level, who just speaks up and shares their mind, but it helps me to understand a little bit more like the real perspective on the ground of what people think of what we're doing.
Um, I, I totally agree that, well, sitting with people and not just through Teams or Zoom communicating, but just like eye to eye,
Yeah.
grabbing a beer in the evening together and to really understand where people are coming from, also learning about their own history and then understanding, okay, well, I always perceived something as being very odd. However, I now I know the history of this person. I know so well where he's coming from or where she's coming from. So I totally agree how valuable this is. So how can well, perhaps when some of our listeners are in organizations where, well, where people may not fully understand there is the need to go somewhere and to meet people in person. How do you think can you ideally argue for exactly this to be to make the well, to make the journey to meet people?
Yeah, it's a great question. I wrestle with this one, Benjamin, because I do think it's really critical to meet in person. I think there's a good imperative for that. I also believe that you can close a lot of gaps virtually
Mm-hmm.
if you have informal conversations.
Mm-hmm.
Part of the problem is that we go into our work life and we have tactics and agendas and,
Exactly.
specific goals we want to achieve in this 30-minute meeting, and you never get the color, you never get to
Mm-hmm.
understand people. So the first thing I would say is like start virtually.
Mm-hmm.
Like go to the lengths you can virtually to understand the culture. And that comes through, for example, on my team, having people share. I have this one pager where they share like their preferences, what they do in their free time, a picture of their community, and just listen to them talk about like what their life looks like. Another thing that I loved that I discovered in the pandemic, I live in Washington, D.C. I live in a city, very proudly live in a city. I worked outside of D.C. about 1 hour. And so my colleagues that were working in the office, when we were remote for COVID, our lives look totally different. I'm in a
Mm-hmm.
city. I have people that are, like walking down the street, or when we weren't walking down the street, it was like really notable. Whereas I had other friends that were horseback riding every day out in the country. And I started asking people, like, what does your life look like at 5 o'clock when you go home for the night? And it's been one of the best questions that I could ask because, and if you ask enough so that you can get a full picture in your mind, you start to develop this understanding of like what people's lives look like outside of work and also culturally in context. So that's the first thing I would say, like, be really curious and spend time in meetings, like set up coffee chats with colleagues in different contexts and just ask them questions until you can picture in your mind what their living room looks like and what they're doing in their free time, what a wedding looks like in their cultural context, what the expectations were for them going to college and having a family. Those things help you understand what matters in the culture. So that's the first thing. And then in terms of making the case for travel, um, the first thing I would say is you can't just, in most organizations these days, say like, well, it's really important for cultural awareness that I spend time with people. It's not
Indeed.
going to work.
Yeah.
And so tying it to a business objective is really critical. And so sometimes that's going to work. I would say like more often than not today, that's a difficult case to make.
Mm-hmm.
So I try and tie it to other actions that are going on in the country, whether for India, it was going for their annual party last year, and tying in an all hands meeting that I would lead. So then it makes it worthwhile. Everybody's gathering at once, and having a speaker is valuable. They would have paid for a speaker. They might as well just have me come. So I try and kind of uh, tack it on to other things. The other things that I learned working in the nonprofit world is I will be scrappy. So I started my career sharing hotel rooms with my colleagues, which I do not advise as an HR professional. And today, I can travel pretty cheaply, and I will do it if it's valuable enough to me in order to be able to spend time with colleagues. And then reporting out on outcomes. So, like my first trip, a 5-day trip, I report back to my boss, to my executive leadership team. What were the insights? What are the actions? And what are the things I'm going to do in follow up? That's one way to, like, it's not a quantitative measure, but it is a qualitative measure of what the outcome was of the trip. And then from there, if you start to be able to stack outcomes or achievement onto those trips, then your leaders are more likely to trust you to use the time wisely.
How do you make sure that you, well, always bearing in mind that 5% of your people are in the US, so relatively close to home, 95% are reasonably remote. How do you make sure that you always get the best people on your teams, given you then need kind of local expertise in India, Romania, Czech Republic, uh, Guatemala, you mentioned,
Guatemala,
and
Costa Rica, Mexico.
exactly right. So you need like local experience basically everywhere.
You do. I think you don't need that on your team. So like I don't need it on my HR team necessarily. Um, Now we have grown in part through acquisition. So a lot we have representatives typically when we're acquiring in each country. But I would say actually this is a good problem to solve in HR. Like historically, you would have local HR representatives in each of the countries that you serve. I have seen companies go to completely outsourcing their kind of HR compliance or HR services component when they're in multiple countries. And I've seen mixed results on that, but that's an option. Um, I use a number of different sites where I will go and research what's going on. Now I'm using ChatGPT and I will just say, like, what are the primary, like, act as a CHRO chat and tell me what are the primary HR policies and guidelines that I need to know about Pakistan. And I will start there to then dive deeper to figure out, like, where do I need to do more research? But I find it's always helpful to have culture makers in each of the countries where we're working. They don't have to be senior leaders and they don't have to be on my team. And then I try and place people on my team in countries where their compliance and operating environment is maybe more complex or different than what my own understanding or experience is. So, for example, Mexico has a more complex operating environment. Canada has a more complex operating environment. Europe always has a more complex operating environment. So, but you don't necessarily have to have somebody in every country. You can find people now who have experience across multiple geographies.
What you already mentioned ChatGPT. So what kind of role does technology play in facilitating leading a global team in the US that is well, it's based in so many different jurisdictions?
Yeah, I think AI is so new. It's such a new thing for all of us to be operating within our daily life, as opposed to, like, there have been products for a number of years that you could pay a lot of money in order to use. But having at all of our fingertips something like Chat GPT, having something like Claude, having the Microsoft tools available, it is kind of wild to think of all of the use cases. And I would love to hear use cases from you as well. But I have found it incredibly useful just to ask people, like, what are you doing with chat? And I try and use it for 15 minutes a day. I find one thing that I can use it for. And that's led to, like, some pretty incredible things, whether it's reducing the time it takes me to create presentations or learning outlines. Like, I took it a lot of times, especially in HR, and don't tell, but a lot of the things that we're doing, like from a first look, are the same. Like
Mhm.
we're looking at an employee life cycle. Check. Every single HR team is looking at the employee life cycle. Everybody is onboarding. Everybody is managing performance. Everybody is managing compensation. And so with that, ChatGPT actually does a really great job at first outlining,
Mhm.
like, I want to do a presentation on merit, how to have an effective merit conversation for my managers. Chat, as a CHRO or as a learning expert, please pull together an outline for what that conversation should look like, with the outcome, like the following outcomes.
Mhm.
Incredible. Like I I could have come up with it, but it takes 10 minutes
Mhm.
for chat to give me about an hour head start on preparing a training. So that's one way I found it useful. I see just incredible opportunities. A friend and colleague was showing how they used chat to optimize their coffee making routine in the morning, showing pictures to chat of what they did. And then chat would say, you know what, you want to heat up your water 2 more degrees in order to optimize the, like, whatever fragrance of the beans. And incredible to think about that use case and how it could apply to manufacturing. How could it apply to the arts? Like, just really interesting to think about how AI will impact our workforce in general. So I don't know if you have any use cases that you want to share, but I find this topic endlessly interesting and important for HR professionals today.
Oh, absolutely. I think it can help in so many ways. And so, for example, looking into these tasks that are kind of repetitive, however, require like lots of fine tuning. Well, something that is repetitive. However, it needs to be individualized, personalized. So I think that it's like absolutely perfect. I do think that AI should not necessarily make decisions, but be a great supporter. And I think there are so many incredible use cases coming up. I personally think it could also be amazing just to well, it's something perhaps a bit down the road, but like okay, feeding AI with like lots of input from let's say composers who have already died, and then well continue their work, right? So that could be
Yeah,
probably super interesting. But coming back to the to HR perspective, I think what it can help a lot with is to keep people up to date. So being like looking at talents, looking at applicants, looking at employees, to make sure, hey, we are all kind of on the same page, and I can easily get those information that I really need to make educated decisions
yeah,
um, from from HR. However, I don't need to bother HR that somebody is like, okay, I have to look that up. Can I get back to you in 2 hours because it will take me some time to look this up. So I think these tasks are perfect for AI indeed, and it's going to be an incredible journey.
absolutely. Yeah, and going back, Benjamin, you mentioned how do I use it in a global context? One thing that I found so helpful, both in drafting executive communications and also simplifying messages so that they're more applicable across English as a second language
Mhm.
population, is to put in AI. Like I put in ChatGPT, like, I'm sending out this message. Will you please simplify the language to be more readable for English as a second language readers? And the changes it makes are incredible. And it takes me 2 minutes to put it in before I send it out to the broader audience. Asking it to shorten my messages, asking it, for example, I don't know if this has happened to you, but in HR, we're frequently asked to ghostwrite for the CEO or ghostwrite for the COO. And I have put in a message, and of course, you have to be careful about like confidentiality and not
Mhm.
putting in messages that you want AI to now spit out to the broader world. But I put in a message that our CEO wrote, and I said, chat act as a ghostwriter for this person. Here is his message, and I am going to give you bullet points. Can you please craft a message in his voice? Crafted the message. I sent it to that leader without really needing to do anything to it because they're going to revise it anyway. And it was great. It was exactly what they needed. That took an hour of my time away from, the overthinking of like, is this really in his voice? Should I add a different way of saying this? So I've found that really incredible. Both the drafting as English as a second language population. I could see that in other cultures as well, drafting it in English for secondary Spanish speakers, and also making messages more succinct, which is always a problem when you're working across the globe.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating, and it's super interesting to hear those use cases. Given it, I think makes also an organization much more inclusive. That everyone is on the same page. In particular, when you have like quite a number of people that communicate to you in their second language, and therefore, yeah, you want everyone included in the conversation. Rather than like through language barriers that may not even be that may not even be that feasible, but it's there, right? And therefore, having a way around that is amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I find it's a really good co-pilot. It's like a good tool to like be a second opinion, give you initial ideas on something, to make sure you don't forget things. I was working through during performance season. What are the things I need to make sure that I cover with my managers? And I just asked chat, and it came up with like, 20 things. I'm not going to cover all 20 of those things, but it's a good checklist to be like, do I feel like my population is going to understand all of these things as we go through performance? So I would encourage everybody to be using it. And I think the reason why is because I see so many broad-ranging implications for workforce design. And we need to be at the forefront of understanding what is it capable of, so that we can help shape the workforce to move with the changes that are happening rather than be left behind. That's my biggest anxiety right now. I've never considered myself a leader in terms of like innovation. I'm not. I don't think most HR people are like at the forefront of innovation, but when I look at what AI is capable of, it is the single most important thing that I think we need to be equipping our team members for, thinking about how we're going to workforce plan and development plan for, and also how we're going to manage equity, because if you look at the internet boom that happened in the 90s, 2000s, you see that it left largely women and ethnic minorities behind. That's a problem. And it's only going to get bigger if AI is adopted primarily by our tech workforces, which are predominantly white. So I'm very concerned about that as well.
The thing is, I think we as human beings, we kind of always think in a linear manner, right? And therefore, exponential growth, like exponential increases of productivity is something we just can't deal with, right? And therefore, I really like this attitude in, you need to educate people, make sure that everyone is on board, and don't leave anyone behind.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Yep. Theresa, thank you so much for your time. It was incredibly inspiring talking to you. Really like the attitude, and it's just super cool. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. This has been a fun conversation. Thanks, Benjamin.
Thank you so much. And guys, thanks a lot for listening in, and see you next time.